15-year-old Tasha Williams was no ordinary teenager. Despite losing both legs in a devastating car accident 2 years ago, she had emerged from the trauma with a resilience that inspired everyone who knew her. Her father, Marcus Williams, a retired Army veteran, had been her rock through the grueling process of recovery and rehabilitation. They shared a bond that went beyond the typical parent-child relationship. They were partners in survival. Marcus, a decorated soldier who had spent years serving his country, now worked as a security guard in their small town while raising Tasha alone. His calm demeanor and strong moral compass were what grounded Tasha, helping her to face life with unwavering determination. Tasha's prosthetic legs were unlike anything most people had ever seen. As part of an experimental program for advanced prosthetics, she had been fitted with custom-designed limbs equipped with state-of-the-art sensors and lightweight alloys. The technology, typically reserved for military veterans, had been granted to Tasha due to Marcus's connections with his former military unit. These legs weren't just tools for walking, they were symbols of her perseverance and a bridge between the life she once had and the one she was forging now. Covered in sleek patterns and integrated with subtle LED lights for visibility, the prosthetics were also a testament to innovation, blending functionality with design. On an unusually warm autumn afternoon, Tasha decided to walk home from the community's science center, where she was part of a local program encouraging young girls to explore technology and engineering. She had spent the day learning about robotics and coding, subjects that fascinated her and allowed her to dream beyond her current reality. The route she chose home passed through Lincoln Park, a sprawling urban area lined with oak trees and winding paths. It was a peaceful place, a spot where people often went to escape the noise of the city. Tasha loved walking through the park, feeling the soft hum of her prosthetics with each step, a quiet reminder of how far she had come. As she reached a shaded bench beneath a large sycamore tree, Tasha decided to take a short break. She adjusted the strap on her left prosthetic, which had been bothering her all day. Sitting down, she pulled out her notebook and began sketching ideas for a design project she had been working on at the center. The park was calm, with only a few joggers and dog walkers in the vicinity. The warm sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. For a moment, she felt entirely at ease. Unbeknownst to Tasha, Officer Darren Wallace was patrolling the area in his squad car. Darren was a middle-aged policeman with a reputation for being overly aggressive and quick to judge. He had served on the force for over a decade, but his career had been marred by complaints of misconduct and an inability to connect with the community he was supposed to protect. Darren's own life was a tangled web of frustrations, failed promotions, a crumbling marriage, and an undercurrent of prejudice that he hid behind a facade of just doing my job. As Darren's patrol car turned onto the road bordering Lincoln Park, his eyes caught sight of Tasha sitting alone on the bench. From his vantage point, the shiny, metallic glint of her prosthetics immediately drew his attention. To him, they didn't look like prosthetics at all. They looked like some kind of advanced technology that, in his mind, didn't belong in the hands of a teenager. Darren's mind, clouded by bias and suspicion, jumped to conclusions. A young black girl alone in the park, with what appeared to be expensive, high-tech equipment. It didn't add up to him. He pulled his car to the side of the road and watched her for a moment, his fingers tapping impatiently on the steering wheel. Tasha remained oblivious to Darren's presence, engrossed in her sketches. She was outlining a concept for a robotic arm when she suddenly felt a chill run down her spine, the kind of instinctive unease that comes from knowing you're being watched. She glanced up and saw Darren stepping out of his patrol car, his figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. His expression was stern, his hand resting on the holster of his belt as he made his way toward her. Tasha's heart began to race, though she wasn't sure why. She had done nothing wrong, yet the intensity in his eyes set her on edge. "Hey, you!" Darren barked as he approached, his voice sharp and commanding. Tasha looked up, startled. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Tasha blinked, confused by his tone. "Just sketching," she replied softly, holding up her notebook as if to prove her innocence. Darren's eyes shifted to her legs, and his expression hardened. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward her prosthetics. Tasha hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "My legs," she said simply, her voice steady but cautious. "Don't get smart with me," Darren snapped. "Those don't look like regular prosthetics. Where'd you get them? Did you steal them?" The accusation hit Tasha like a slap. She stared at him, incredulous. "What? No. These are mine, they're part of a medical program." Darren stepped closer, towering over her. "Medical program, huh? You expect me to believe that? A kid like you walking around with something that looks like it belongs in a government lab." "Yeah, right." Tasha felt anger bubbling beneath her fear. She had faced enough prejudice and ignorance in her life to recognize it instantly. "They're mine," she said firmly. "You can't just assume." "Stand up," Darren interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I need to take a closer look." Tasha hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to refuse, to tell him that he had no right to question her like this. But she also knew the risks of defiance, especially in situations like these. Slowly she stood, her movements deliberate. Darren's eyes narrowed as he examined her prosthetics, stepping uncomfortably close. Without warning, he reached down and grabbed her left leg, yanking it off with a force that sent Tasha stumbling backward. The suddenness of the act left her stunned, her balance compromised as she fell to the ground. Pain shot through her as she landed on her side, and her notebook tumbled to the dirt. The sight of her on the ground, vulnerable and humiliated, seemed to embolden Darren. "This doesn't belong to you," he said coldly, holding the prosthetic in his hand like it was evidence in a crime. "I'm confiscating it until we figure out where you got it." Tasha, her voice shaking but defiant, looked up at him. "You have no idea what you've just done." Tasha lay on the ground for a moment, stunned by what had just happened. Her left side throbbed from the impact of her fall, but the emotional weight of the situation was far worse. She had never felt so humiliated or powerless. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Should she try to explain herself again? Should she stand up for herself? But how could she, with one leg now missing and the other still attached? A stark reminder of her vulnerability. Officer Darren Wallace loomed over her, holding her prosthetic as though it were some kind of incriminating evidence. His expression was hard, unyielding, and entirely devoid of empathy. "You can explain this at the station," he said flatly, turning toward his patrol car with the prosthetic in hand. He didn't even bother to help her up or check if she was injured. To him, she wasn't a person in that moment just a suspect. Tasha pushed herself up with her hands, gritting her teeth as dirt scraped against her palms. Her remaining prosthetic leg shifted awkwardly under her, struggling to balance her weight without its counterpart. The LED lights on the prosthetic still attached to her right leg flickered faintly, catching Darren's eye. He stopped mid-step and turned back to her with a look of suspicion. "What else do you have on you?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. Tasha, her voice trembling but edged with defiance, responded, "Nothing. Just give me my leg back." Darren narrowed his eyes, his hand hovering near his holster. "Don't raise your voice at me, kid. You think you can talk to me like that? I'm the one in charge here." Tasha's anger began to overshadow her fear. She struggled to sit up straight, looking him squarely in the eye. "You're not in charge of me. You don't even know what you're talking about." Darren's face flushed red with irritation. He marched back toward her, gripping the prosthetic like it was some kind of trophy. "I've had enough of your attitude," he snapped, standing over her once again. "Kids like you think you can get away with anything, but not on my watch." By now, a few passers-by had started to notice the scene unfolding. A jogger slowed to a stop, pulling out their headphones to watch from a distance. A woman walking her dog hesitated, looking back and forth between Darren and Tasha, as though unsure whether to intervene. But Darren's aggressive stance and the sight of his uniform seemed to keep them all at bay. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. Tasha noticed the onlookers but didn't draw attention to them. She knew better than to expect help. People might watch, they might whisper, but they wouldn't act not against a police officer. She had seen this play out before, not with herself but in the stories her father had told her. Stories about injustice, about people standing by because they were too afraid or too indifferent to get involved. "I told you these are mine," she said again, her voice steadier now. "They were custom made for me. You have no right to take them." Darren scoffed, his grip tightening on the prosthetic. "Custom made, huh? For a kid like you? Don't make me laugh. These things cost more than most people make in a year. There's no way you're telling the truth." Tasha clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to control her growing rage. "My dad's a veteran," she said firmly. "He got them for me through his unit. They're part of a medical program." But Darren wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind, and nothing Tasha said was going to change that. To him, she was lying, trying to talk her way out of trouble. He crouched down beside her, his voice dropping to a mocking tone. "If your story checks out, maybe you'll get them back. But until then, I'm keeping this. Consider it evidence." Tasha stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly as her emotions churned. Her mind flashed to her father what he would say, what he would do if he were here. Marcus had always told her to stay calm, to think before she acted, but in this moment it felt impossible. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to grab her leg and run, but she couldn't. Not like this. As Darren stood up again, turning once more toward his car, Tasha made a decision. She wasn't going to let him leave with her prosthetic. Summoning every ounce of strength and balance she had, she pushed herself up onto her one remaining leg. The motion was shaky and unsteady, but she managed to stand. She wobbled slightly, catching herself against the edge of the bench for support. Darren turned back, his eyes narrowing in irritation. "Sit down," he ordered. "You're only making this harder on yourself." But Tasha didn't sit down. She looked him in the eye, her voice steady and firm. "Give it back," she demanded. Darren took a step toward her, his hand now resting on his holster. "You're one step away from getting arrested," he said coldly. "I don't care how young you are. If you don't comply, I'll bring you in for resisting." "Then arrest me," Tasha shot back, her voice rising. "But you're not taking my leg." For a moment, the air between them was electric with tension. Darren stared at her, his hand twitching near his belt. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a teenager, and it was clear that her defiance was getting under his skin. The onlookers, now numbering 3 or 4, shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs barely audible. Before Darren could respond, a deep, commanding voice cut through the tension like a knife. "What the hell is going on here?" Both Tasha and Darren turned to see Marcus Williams striding toward them, his expression a mixture of anger and controlled fury. He had been on his way home from work when he spotted the commotion in the park. The sight of his daughter standing on one leg, her prosthetic in the hands of a police officer, sent a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. Marcus was still in his security uniform, his badge glinting in the sunlight. His broad shoulders and military bearing made him an imposing figure, and for a brief moment, even Darren seemed to hesitate. But the hesitation was fleeting. Darren straightened his posture, attempting to reassert his authority. "Stay back," Darren barked, holding up a hand as Marcus approached. "This is police business." Marcus ignored him, his focus entirely on Tasha. He reached her in 3 long strides, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You okay, baby?" he asked, his voice softening slightly. Tasha nodded, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. "He took my leg," she said quietly, her voice trembling. Marcus's jaw tightened, his gaze snapping to Darren. "You took her prosthetic," he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Darren raised the prosthetic slightly, as if to justify his actions. "She couldn't prove it was hers," he said defensively. "It looked suspicious. Expensive equipment like this doesn't just show up in a park." Marcus took a step forward, his towering frame forcing Darren to take an involuntary step back. "That leg," Marcus said slowly, his voice like steel, "was made for my daughter. It's hers. And you're going to give it back? Now." Marcus stood tall, his imposing frame radiating controlled fury as he locked eyes with Officer Darren Wallace. The tension between them was palpable, and the onlookers nearby couldn't look away, though none dared intervene. Tasha leaned against the bench, barely able to balance on her one prosthetic leg. Her father's presence gave her a flicker of hope, but she could see the storm brewing in his eyes. She knew that when Marcus got that look, it meant he wasn't backing down. Darren, clutching the confiscated prosthetic in his hand, seemed torn between asserting his authority and acknowledging the mistake that was now glaringly obvious. But Darren wasn't the type to admit fault easily. His pride and years of unchecked power made him double down. He took a step back to put some space between himself and Marcus, his hand still hovering near his holster, as if to remind everyone who had the badge and the gun. "I'm not giving anything back until I've verified its ownership," Darren said firmly, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his tone. "She can't prove it's hers, and equipment like this doesn't just show up on teenagers in parks. If this is government property or stolen tech, it's my duty to confiscate it." Marcus's eyes darkened further. He took another step closer, closing the distance Darren had tried to create. His voice, low and measured, carried the weight of a man who had faced far more dangerous threats than an overzealous cop. "Let me make this very clear," Marcus said, his voice steady but sharp. "That is not stolen. That is my daughter's leg, custom made for her as part of a program for disabled veterans' families. You've humiliated her, hurt her, and now you're trying to take what belongs to her. I don't care who you are or what badge you wear, you're going to give it back, right? Now." The authority in Marcus's tone caught Darren off guard, but he recovered quickly, his defensive instincts kicking in. He raised his free hand in a mock gesture of control, trying to reassert his position. "Sir, step back," Darren said, his voice louder now, hoping to draw attention to Marcus's proximity. "I'm giving you a lawful order. Interfering with police business is a criminal offense, and I won't hesitate to escalate this." Marcus didn't flinch. His entire body radiated calm, controlled defiance, but there was a sharpness in his tone that warned Darren not to push him further. "You've already escalated this," Marcus replied, his voice unwavering. "You put your hands on my daughter, took something that belongs to her, and humiliated her in public. If anyone's out of line here, it's you. And don't think for a second that I don't know my rights." Tasha watched her father with a mix of awe and fear. She had seen him like this before, resolute, immovable, and utterly fearless, but never in a situation like this. Her heart pounded as she balanced precariously, gripping the edge of the bench for support. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "please don't." But Marcus wasn't listening. His protective instincts had taken over completely. He kept his gaze locked on Darren, daring him to make the next move. Darren, meanwhile, was growing visibly more agitated. The crowd of onlookers had grown, their murmurs creating a low hum of tension in the air. Darren could feel their eyes on him, could sense the growing unease in the atmosphere. This wasn't going the way he had planned. He had thought the situation would end with a quick show of authority, a confiscation, and a young girl left too afraid to protest. Instead, he was now face to face with a man who not only refused to back down but seemed entirely unfazed by his authority. Darren's frustration boiled over. "That's it," he snapped, stepping forward and reaching for his handcuffs. "Turn around. Both of you. You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting an officer." Before Darren could grab him, Marcus's hand shot up, his palm open in a gesture that stopped Darren in his tracks. It wasn't a violent motion, but it was enough to make the officer hesitate. "Don't," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't even think about it." Darren froze for a moment, his hand hovering in mid-air. The authority in Marcus's voice made him falter, but only briefly. His pride and need to reassert control quickly overrode his hesitation. "Are you threatening me?" Darren barked, his voice rising. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need to threaten you," he said calmly. "I'm telling you what's going to happen. You're going to hand over that prosthetic, apologize to my daughter, and walk away. Or you're going to make the biggest mistake of your career." The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air, but Darren refused to back down. He grabbed his radio and barked into it. "Dispatch, I need backup at Lincoln Park. I've got a situation with multiple hostile individuals." The crackling voice on the other end of the radio confirmed the request, and Darren smirked as he clipped it back onto his belt. "Let's see how tough you are when backup gets here," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he crossed his arms and gave Darren a look that could cut through steel. "You really think backup is going to fix this for you?" he asked, his voice calm but icy. "When they get here and see what you've done, how you tore a prosthetic off a disabled girl in front of witnesses, you think they're going to back you up? You're digging your own grave, Officer Wallace." Darren's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "We'll see about that." As they stood locked in their standoff, one of the onlookers finally stepped forward, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Officer," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the tension, "I've been watching this whole thing, and what you're doing is completely out of line. That's a young girl's prosthetic you're holding. Are you seriously going to arrest her and her father over this?" Darren turned to her, his irritation growing. "Stay out of this, ma'am," he snapped. "This is official police business." But the woman didn't back down. "Official police business," she repeated, her voice rising. "Looks more like harassment to me. You think just because you've got a badge you can treat people however you want. Not on my watch." Her words emboldened others in the crowd, who began murmuring their agreement. Darren's control over the situation was slipping fast, and he knew it. His radio crackled again, signaling that backup was en route, but he wasn't sure he could hold out that long. The crowd's growing hostility was palpable, and Marcus's unyielding presence was making him increasingly uncomfortable. Marcus, sensing Darren's weakening resolve, took a step closer. "It's over, officer," he said firmly. "The longer you drag this out, the worse it's going to be for you." Do the right thing. Hand it over. For a moment, it seemed like Darren might relent. His grip on the prosthetic loosened slightly, and his eyes darted nervously between Marcus and the crowd. But then his pride flared up again, and he shook his head. "I'm not handing over anything," he said stubbornly. Just then, a second police car pulled up, its lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, their expressions wary as they took in the scene. Darren immediately straightened, waving them over. "About time you got here," he said. "We've got a situation." One of the officers, a woman with a calm but authoritative demeanor, approached Marcus and Tasha. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone neutral. Before Darren could speak, Marcus gestured toward Tasha. "Ask my daughter," he said simply. "She'll tell you everything." Tasha, still trembling but finding her voice, recounted the events with remarkable clarity. As she spoke, the female officer's expression shifted from neutral to stern, her gaze snapping toward Darren. "You took her prosthetic?" she asked sharply. "It was suspicious," Darren protested. "I was doing my job." The officer didn't look convinced. "Suspicious? It's a prosthetic leg. For a teenager. And you thought the best course of action was to rip it off her in the middle of a park." The crowd murmured louder now, their outrage growing. Darren's backup had arrived, but instead of diffusing the situation in his favor, it was turning against him. He opened his mouth to argue, but the female officer raised a hand to silence him. "Enough," she said firmly. "Hand it back. Now." For the first time, Darren hesitated. His face flushed with anger and humiliation, but under the weight of the crowd, his colleagues and Marcus's unwavering gaze, he finally relented. With a huff, he thrust the prosthetic toward Marcus, who took it without a word. Marcus knelt beside Tasha, helping her reattach the prosthetic with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the tension around them. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am now." As Marcus helped her to her feet, he turned to Darren one last time. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "You don't mess with my daughter and walk away clean." The tension in the park hung thick in the air as Marcus helped Tasha steady herself on her prosthetic leg. Despite her outward composure, Tasha's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the straps. Her father crouched beside her to ensure everything was secure. The female officer who had arrived moments earlier, her name tag read Morale, stood between Darren and Marcus, her sharp eyes flicking between them as she tried to piece together the chaotic situation. The onlookers, emboldened by Morales' intervention, had grown louder in their murmurs, their voices carrying a mix of anger and disbelief over what they had witnessed. Darren, meanwhile, stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck bulged. His grip hovered near his belt, as though the physical presence of his equipment might reassert the control he had clearly lost. He opened his mouth to speak, but Morales cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Officer Wallace," Morales said, her voice even but steely, "I need a full explanation of your actions, and I need it now." Darren squared his shoulders, doing his best to maintain an air of authority, despite the fact that his position was crumbling beneath him. The girl was acting suspiciously, he said, his tone defensive. She was in possession of what appeared to be high-value technology, and when questioned, she became non-compliant. "I acted within protocol." "Non-compliant?" Morales echoed, her voice tinged with incredulity. She gestured toward Tasha, who now stood next to Marcus, her slim frame dwarfed by her father's protective stance. "That's a 15-year-old girl, Officer Wallace. Her prosthetics are medical devices, not stolen contraband, and ripping one off her leg. That's not protocol. That's excessive force, and you know it." Darren's face darkened, but he didn't respond. The crowd around them had grown, their discontent becoming more audible with each passing moment. Morales turned to Marcus, her tone softening slightly. "Mr. Williams, I want to make sure your daughter is okay. Is there anything she needs medical attention, perhaps?" Marcus shook his head, though his eyes never left Darren. "She's fine now. But what she needs, what we need, is accountability for what just happened here." Morales nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. She turned back to Darren, who was now fidgeting under her scrutiny. "Officer Wallace, I'm going to need you to step back while I get statements from both Mr. Williams and his daughter. This is no longer your scene." Darren's face twisted in indignation. "Step back," he repeated, his voice rising. "You're seriously taking their side over a fellow officer." "I was doing my job, Morales. What happened to having each other's backs?" "This isn't about sides," Morales snapped, her tone sharp enough to silence him. "This is about doing what's right. And right now, what's right is listening to the people you just manhandled without cause." The crowd murmured their approval, and Darren's face flushed red. He took a step back, but his glare remained fixed on Marcus, his pride clearly wounded. Morales exhaled quietly, then turned to Tasha with a gentler expression. "Tasha, is it?" she asked. "I'm sorry you had to go through this. Can you tell me what happened in your own words?" Tasha hesitated, glancing up at her father for reassurance. Marcus gave her a small nod, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She took a deep breath, then began to recount the events, her voice steady despite the emotional strain. She described how Darren had approached her without explanation, accused her of theft, and forcibly removed her prosthetic. As she spoke, Morales listened intently, her expression growing darker with every detail. When Tasha finished, Morales nodded and turned to Marcus. "Thank you, Tasha," she said softly before addressing Marcus directly. "And you, Mr. Williams? You arrived after the confrontation began, correct?" Marcus nodded. "I was walking home when I saw my daughter on the ground. He had her prosthetic in his hand, and she was struggling to get up. I approached to protect her, as any father would." "And did you make any physical contact with Officer Wallace?" Morales asked, her tone careful but non-accusatory. Marcus shook his head firmly. "No, I didn't. But I wasn't about to stand by and let him continue to humiliate my daughter. I told him to return what was hers and to back off. That's it." Morales nodded again, clearly satisfied with his response. She turned to Darren, her professional veneer beginning to crack under the weight of her frustration. "Wallace, we've got multiple witnesses here, including Mr. Williams, his daughter, and half the people in this park, who all seem to agree that your actions were unnecessary and inappropriate. Care to explain yourself further?" Darren's temper finally snapped. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "I was doing my job, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let a bunch of civilians and you make me out to be the bad guy here. You think you know better than me? You weren't even here." "Enough," Morales said, her voice cutting through his rant like a whip. She stepped closer to Darren, her tone low but forceful. "This isn't about me or you. This is about an abuse of power, and right now you're only digging yourself a deeper hole. Stand down, Wallace." "That's an order." Darren's hands balled into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. He turned away, muttering under his breath, but made no further attempts to intervene. Morales let out a quiet sigh of relief before turning back to Marcus and Tasha. "Mr. Williams," she said, "I want to assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. I'll make sure of it personally. For now, I'd like to escort you and your daughter home to ensure there are no further issues." Marcus hesitated for a moment, his protective instincts still on high alert. But Tasha tugged lightly on his sleeve, her voice soft. "Dad, let's just go. Please." Marcus looked down at her, his expression softening slightly. He nodded, then turned to Morales. "Fine. But I'm not letting this go. What happened here today, it's not just about my daughter. It's about every kid who's been treated like this, every parent who's had to watch it happen. There needs to be change." Morales met his gaze, her expression sincere. "I understand," she said, "and I agree. Let's take it one step at a time." With that, she signaled for Marcus and Tasha to follow her toward the edge of the park. Darren watched them go, his fists still clenched and his face a mask of barely contained rage. But even as they walked away, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Darren wasn't the kind of man to let go of a grudge, and Marcus knew better than to underestimate him. As they reached the edge of the park, Morales turned to Marcus one last time. "I'll file the report tonight," she promised. "You have my word." Marcus nodded, but his eyes were distant, his mind already working through what needed to be done next. He wasn't about to rely solely on the system to deliver justice, not when it was clear how easily it could be corrupted. He needed to be ready for whatever came next, for both himself and Tasha. As they walked home, Tasha reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his tightly. "Thanks, Dad," she said quietly. Marcus looked down at her, his expression softening. "Always, baby girl," he replied. "Always." But even as he said it, he couldn't ignore the unease that gnawed at him. Darren Wallace was a problem, and Marcus knew that problems like him didn't just go away. The air at home was quiet but tense as Marcus and Tasha returned from the park. Tasha, still shaken from the incident, retreated to her room without saying much, leaving Marcus alone in the kitchen. He sat at the table, his large hands gripping the edge as he replayed the confrontation in his mind. The image of Darren Wallace holding Tasha's prosthetic, her body crumpled on the ground, burned into his memory. His protective instincts warred with his rational mind, and though he had kept his composure in the park, the storm within him now raged unchecked. He knew men like Darren. During his years in the military, Marcus had encountered too many people who let power cloud their judgment. Men who hid behind their authority, using it as a shield to justify their own insecurities and prejudices. Darren wasn't unique in that regard. He was just another example of a system that too often failed the very people it was meant to serve. But this time it was personal. Darren hadn't just abused his power, he had targeted Marcus's daughter, humiliated her, and stripped away her dignity. That Marcus could not let stand. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Marcus finally stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring out the kitchen window into the fading light. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Tasha's door creaking open. She shuffled into the kitchen, her steps uneven as she adjusted to her prosthetic, which Marcus had carefully reattached after the incident. "You okay, baby girl?" Marcus asked, his voice soft but steady. Tasha nodded, though her eyes were downcast. She slid into a chair at the table, resting her arms on the surface. "I'm fine," she said quietly, but Marcus could hear the weight in her tone. I don't get it, Dad. Why did he do that? I didn't do anything wrong." Marcus sat down across from her, his large hands folding together on the table. He looked at her for a long moment, his heart aching for the pain he saw in her eyes. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people like him don't need a reason. They see what they want to see, and they act on it. It's not about what you did or didn't do, it's about their own ignorance and fear." Tasha frowned, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of his words. "But he's supposed to protect people, right? Isn't that what cops are supposed to do?" Marcus sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. That's what they're supposed to do, he said. But not everyone who wears that badge understands what it means. Some people use it as a weapon instead of a shield. And when that happens, people like us people who don't look like them end up paying the price. Tasha nodded slowly, though she didn't seem fully convinced. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. It's not fair, she murmured. No, Marcus agreed. It's not. But that doesn't mean we let it slide. We fight back not with anger or violence, but with the truth. We hold them accountable. Tasha looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. How? She asked. How do we fight back? Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't respond. Then, with a deliberate motion, he pushed back his chair and stood. It starts with making sure they know we won't be silent, he said. Stay here. I'll be back in a bit. Where are you going? Tasha asked, her voice tinged with concern. Marcus rested a hand on her shoulder and gave her a reassuring squeeze. Just need to make a few calls, he said. Don't worry. I'll take care of it. As he left the house, Marcus's mind was already working. He had connections, former comrades from his military days, people who had gone on to work in law enforcement, politics, and even advocacy groups. If there was one thing Marcus had learned in his years of service, it was that change didn't come from waiting, it came from action. And he was more than ready to act. His first call was to James, an old army buddy who now worked as a private investigator. James had always been resourceful, and Marcus trusted him implicitly. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Marcus got straight to the point, recounting the incident in the park and describing Darren Wallace in detail. I need everything you can find on this guy, Marcus said. Past complaints, disciplinary actions, anything. I want to know who he really is. James didn't hesitate. I'll get on it, he promised. Give me a day or two and I'll have something for you. Next, Marcus reached out to another contact, Angela, a lawyer who specialized in civil rights cases. She had represented several families in the past who had been victims of police misconduct, and Marcus knew she wouldn't back down from a fight. Angela, he said when she picked up, I've got a situation and I need your help. As Marcus recounted the events, Angela listened intently, her tone growing more serious with every detail. That's unacceptable, she said firmly when he finished. If everything you're saying checks out, we can absolutely build a case against him. Do you have witnesses? Evidence? There were plenty of people in the park, Marcus said. Some of them were recording. I'll see if I can track down any footage. Good, Angela said. Get me everything you can. We'll make sure this guy answers for what he did. By the time Marcus returned home, the weight in his chest had eased slightly. He wasn't naive, he knew this wouldn't be an easy fight. But he also knew he wasn't alone. He had people on his side, people who believed in justice and accountability, and with their help, he would make sure Darren Wallace faced the consequences of his actions. The next day, as Marcus was reviewing some notes Angela had sent him, his phone buzzed with a call from James. You're not going to believe this, James said, his voice low. That cop Wallace? He's got a history. Complaints about excessive force, racial profiling, you name it. Most of it got buried. But there's enough here to show a pattern. Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. Send me everything, he said. Within minutes, Marcus had a folder of documents in his inbox, detailing Darren's checkered history. There were multiple complaints filed by civilians, most of which had been dismissed without investigation. A few internal reports hinted at disciplinary action, but they were vague and incomplete. It was clear that Darren had been protected by the system until now. Later that evening, as Marcus sat with Tasha at the kitchen table, he shared what he had learned. This isn't just about you, he told her. This guy's been doing this for years, but now we have the chance to stop him." Tasha looked at her father, a spark of determination lighting up her eyes. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We keep pushing," Marcus said. "We don't let this go." Over the next few days, Marcus worked tirelessly to gather more evidence. He contacted witnesses from the park, many of whom were eager to speak out after seeing what had happened. One woman had even captured the entire incident on her phone, and the video was damning. It showed Darren ripping off Tasha's prosthetic, her fall, and Marcus's calm but firm response. The footage left no room for doubt about who was in the wrong. Armed with this evidence, Marcus and Angela prepared to file a formal complaint against Darren Wallace. But Marcus wasn't content to stop there. He reached out to local community leaders, sharing the video and rallying support for broader changes in the police department. This wasn't just about one officer, it was about addressing a system that allowed people like Darren to operate without accountability. As the momentum built, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had always believed in standing up for what was right, but this fight was about more than just justice for Tasha. It was about creating a safer, fairer world for everyone, and he wasn't going to stop until that goal was within reach. The morning of the hearing arrived with an air of tension that hung heavy over the Williams household. Marcus had barely slept the night before, running through every possible scenario in his mind. Tasha, though outwardly composed, had spent most of the morning in silence, clutching the notebook she always carried. Her prosthetic legs, polished and secure, stood as a quiet testament to her resilience. Marcus had reminded her again and again that this wasn't just about her, it was about holding people accountable and making sure that what happened in the park wouldn't happen to someone else. Tasha nodded each time, but the weight of the situation clearly bore down on her. By the time they arrived at the city council chambers, the room was already buzzing with quiet murmurs. A mix of reporters, community leaders, and citizens filled the gallery. At the center of the room, Officer Darren Wallace sat stiffly, flanked by his lawyer and a handful of uniformed colleagues who looked uneasy being there. His face was a mask of defiance, though his jaw twitched slightly when Marcus and Tasha entered the room. Marcus didn't flinch under Darren's glare. Instead, he gave a subtle nod to Angela, who sat a few rows ahead, preparing her notes. James was there too, seated near the back, his sharp eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. The hearing began with formalities, the council members outlining the scope of the proceedings. This wasn't a criminal trial yet. It was an internal review, sparked by the formal complaint Marcus and Angela had filed, along with the mounting evidence they had gathered. Darren's career and reputation were on the line, and everyone in the room knew it. More than that, this was a public reckoning for a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. Angela was the first to speak, laying out the sequence of events with precision and clarity. She detailed Darren's approach in the park, the unjustified confiscation of Tasha's prosthetic, and the excessive force used against a minor. She presented eyewitness statements and played the damning video recorded by the bystander, which elicited audible gasps from the audience. The footage didn't lie, it showed Darren ripping the prosthetic from Tasha's leg, her painful fall to the ground, and his cold indifference as Marcus calmly but firmly confronted him. When the video ended, Angela turned to the council. "This isn't just about one incident," she said, her voice steady but impassioned. "This is about a pattern of behavior, a misuse of authority, and a failure to uphold the oath to protect and serve." Officer Wallace didn't see a young girl in need of respect and understanding. He saw a target. And if this body fails to act, it sends a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable. That cannot stand. The council members exchanged glances, their expressions serious. Darren's lawyer rose to respond, attempting to frame his actions as a misunderstanding, a situation that had spiraled out of control due to miscommunication. He emphasized Darren's years of service and argued that he had acted out of caution, not malice. But the argument fell flat when Marcus was called to the stand. As he approached the microphone, his broad shoulders and calm demeanor commanded the room's attention. He adjusted the microphone slightly, then looked directly at the council members, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "My name is Marcus Williams," he began. "I'm a retired Army veteran. I served my country for over a decade, and I did so because I believed in the principles of justice, equality, and accountability. What happened in that park wasn't just an attack on my daughter, it was an attack on those principles." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Officer Wallace didn't ask questions. He didn't seek to understand. He saw a young black girl and assumed the worst. He humiliated her, hurt her, and took something that was not his to take. And when confronted, he doubled down instead of admitting his mistake. That's not protecting and serving. That's abusing power. The room was silent except for the faint scribbling of reporters taking notes. Marcus turned slightly, gesturing toward Tasha, who sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "My daughter is strong," he said, his voice softening. "Stronger than anyone I know. But she shouldn't have to be. She shouldn't have to carry the weight of proving her innocence every time someone looks at her and sees something they don't understand. No child should." He turned back to the council, his tone sharpening. "This isn't just about Darren Wallace. This is about a system that allows people like him to act without consequences. If you don't hold him accountable, you're telling every officer out there that they can do the same. And you're telling every parent like me that their children don't matter. Is that the message you want to send?" When Marcus finished, the room erupted into quiet murmurs again. Even Darren's colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. Tasha looked up at her father, a flicker of pride breaking through her nervous expression. The council called several other witnesses, including the bystander who had recorded the video and a community leader who spoke about the broader implications of unchecked police misconduct. By the time Darren himself was called to speak, the atmosphere in the room was heavy with tension. Darren rose slowly, his face a mixture of defiance and unease. He approached the microphone, his lawyer at his side, and cleared his throat. "I've served this community for over 10 years, he began, his voice measured but strained. "I've always done my job to the best of my ability. What happened in that park was regrettable, but it was never my intention to harm anyone." He paused, glancing toward the council members as though searching for sympathy. "I was acting on instinct, trying to assess a potentially suspicious situation. If my actions were perceived as excessive, I apologize. But I stand by my duty to ensure public safety." The apology, if it could even be called that, rang hollow. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, and Marcus felt his fists clench at his sides. Darren's words lacked sincerity, and it was clear he still didn't understand or refused to acknowledge the harm he had caused. The council deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Marcus sat beside Tasha, his arm draped protectively over her shoulders as they waited. Angela leaned forward in her seat, her fingers steepled under her chin, her eyes fixed on the council members. Finally, the lead council member rose, calling the room to order. After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony from all parties, the council member began. "We have determined that Officer Darren Wallace violated departmental protocols and used excessive force in his handling of the incident at Lincoln Park. Effective immediately, Officer Wallace is suspended without pay, pending further investigation. The decision sent a ripple through the room. While it wasn't the full termination Marcus had hoped for, it was a step in the right direction, a clear message that Darren's behavior wouldn't be swept under the rug. Tasha exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and Marcus gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. As the room began to clear, Darren stormed out, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Marcus watched him go, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't the end, not yet. There was still more to be done. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice, though incomplete, was finally in motion. On the steps outside the council chambers, Marcus knelt down to Tasha's level, his hands resting on her shoulders. "You did good, baby girl," he said, his voice full of pride. Tasha managed a small smile. "So did you, Dad?" Together they walked away from the courthouse, their steps slow but steady. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in days, Marcus felt like they were finally winning. And that was enough to keep him moving forward. The weeks following the hearing were a whirlwind of change, tension and reflection for Marcus and Tasha. The decision to suspend Officer Darren Wallace had sent shockwaves through the community, sparking heated debates among residents, law enforcement, and local officials. While some supported the council's decision, others criticized it as too lenient. For Marcus, it was a step forward, but he knew it wasn't the end of the fight. Darren's suspension was temporary, and Marcus had no illusions about how far the system would go to protect its own if the pressure on them subsided. At home, Marcus focused on ensuring that Tasha felt supported. The incident had left deep emotional scars on her, and though she was resilient, it was clear the experience had shaken her confidence. She spent hours in her room, sketching in her notebook or tinkering with small robotics projects to distract herself. Marcus gave her space but made a point to check in often, sitting with her in the evenings and sharing stories from his military days. He wanted her to know she wasn't alone, that they were a team, and he'd always have her back. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Tasha looked up from her sketchbook, her brow furrowed in thought. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "do you think he'll ever admit he was wrong?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "I don't know, baby girl," he admitted. "Some people can't face the truth about themselves, even when it's staring them in the face. But whether he admits it or not doesn't change what we know is right. You stood up for yourself. You showed him, and everyone else, that you won't be silenced. That matters more than anything he could ever say." Tasha nodded, though her expression remained pensive. "I just don't want this to happen to anyone else," she said softly. "Not just because of me, but because it's wrong." Marcus reached across the table, resting a hand over hers. "That's why we keep fighting," he said. "Not with anger or hate, but with action. We've already started making a difference, Tasha, and we're not stopping now." True to his word, Marcus threw himself into advocacy work. With the help of Angela and James, he began organizing community meetings to address police misconduct and push for reforms. The meetings were raw and emotional, as residents shared their stories of harassment and abuse at the hands of law enforcement. Marcus listened intently, his military training helping him maintain a calm, steady presence even as the pain and anger in the room threatened to boil over. At the third meeting, Tasha surprised Marcus by asking if she could speak. He watched with pride as she stood before the gathered crowd, her voice clear and unwavering despite her nervousness. "My name is Tasha Williams," she began, "and I'm here because I want to tell you what happened to me and why it can't keep happening to anyone else." She recounted the incident in the park, her words measured but powerful. She spoke about the humiliation of having her prosthetic torn away, the fear of being treated as less than human, and the determination she felt to ensure no one else would have to endure the same. By the time she finished, the room was silent and several people were visibly moved. Marcus felt a swell of pride as he watched his daughter step into her own strength. After the meeting, several attendees approached Tasha to thank her for her bravery. One woman, a mother with 2 young children, hugged her tightly. "You're so strong," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for standing up for all of us." As the weeks went on, Tasha's confidence began to return. She threw herself into her robotics projects with renewed vigor, often working late into the night on designs for adaptive technology she hoped could one day help others like her. Marcus encouraged her every step of the way, even helping her build prototypes when she needed an extra pair of hands. Meanwhile, the investigation into Darren Wallace continued. Angela kept Marcus informed of every development, and the evidence they had gathered proved damning. Internal documents revealed that Darren had a long history of complaints, many of which had been quietly dismissed or buried. The video of his actions in the park had made it impossible for the department to sweep this incident under the rug, and public pressure from the community only added fuel to the fire. Eventually, the department announced that Darren would be terminated from the force. The decision was met with a mix of relief and vindication for Marcus and Tasha, though Marcus couldn't ignore the lingering bitterness he felt. Darren had lost his badge, but the scars he'd left on his victims, Tasha included, would take much longer to heal. In the months that followed, Marcus and Tasha worked tirelessly to turn their ordeal into a catalyst for change. They partnered with local advocacy groups to create programs focused on building trust between law enforcement and the community. Tasha even presented one of her designs, a compact, wearable device that could record interactions and upload them directly to a secure cloud server at a public safety conference. The design was met with widespread interest, and Tasha was thrilled to see her work being taken seriously. Through it all, Marcus remained a steady source of strength for his daughter. He continued to share stories from his time in the military, weaving lessons about resilience, leadership, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Tasha absorbed these lessons eagerly, and Marcus could see the fire in her growing brighter with each passing day. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Tasha turned to her father with a small smile. "You know," she said, "if this hadn't happened, I don't think I'd be as sure of myself as I am now. It was awful, but I feel stronger because of it." Marcus looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "That's what life is, baby girl," he said. "It throws things at you, hard things. But you get to decide how you handle them. You didn't let this break you. You stood tall even when it hurt. That's what strength looks like." Tasha nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "And it's not just about me," she said. "It's about everyone. If I can make a difference, even a small one, then it's worth it." Marcus smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "You're already making a difference," he said. "And you're just getting started." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, father and daughter sat together, their bond stronger than ever. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it together. For Marcus, the fight for justice wasn't just about righting the wrongs of the past, it was about building a better future for his daughter and for everyone who came after her. And for Tasha, it was about proving that even in the face of adversity, she could rise above it and shine.